talk to the various GOP caucuses and others on Capitol Hill. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be doing my first event at Policy Exchange. So I think on the one hand, Western support has held together remarkably well since the beginning of the war. Certainly the leadership in the United States and in most European countries, obviously there's some exceptions, Hungary being a major one, Slovakia now too, and different parties, it's held together well. But on the other hand, if you look at the debates within the US Congress now, there's definitely much more questioning in the Republican Party with the new Republican speaker and among Republican voters about whether one should continue supporting Ukraine at all or to the extent that it's been supported before. I think in countries like Germany, there's also a debate. Again, popular opinion, I think, is still in favor of supporting Ukraine, but there are more debates about how long this should go on. And I think we have, obviously, a major presidential election coming up in the United States next year, and this will be one of the subjects during the campaign. People will want to know, well, we've given all this money to support to Ukraine, and how well has it worked? And you know, there's a lot of, in the media nowadays questioning, you know, the success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and why Ukraine hasn't done better. Again, this is in a lot of the media, and so that they're going to be hard questions asked. And I think in the US case particularly, this may be the last year when we have this level of support for Ukraine. Hopefully the National Defense Authorization Act will be passed by the end of the year, and it will have money in it for Ukraine. The debate at the moment is, you know, do you send all the money or most of the money to Israel as opposed to Ukraine? But the White House has determined that both countries will get support. But I think, you know, when we look at elections that are going to be coming up in Europe next year, you may get more parties winning that are more skeptical about this. And the Russian, you know, narratives are still quite powerful with some people. So hopefully it will last, but and there won't be Ukraine fatigue. But some of that has set in.
Can I just ask more specifically again? It's a particular interest to us here, obviously, part of sort of Anglo-American dialogue that we've fostered for some years, many in this country, is just where you see where the fault lines are now within the Republican Party, specifically a little more detail on that. Certainly. And what's tilting the balance there, and are there any people from abroad that could have an impact on that debate in the United States?
Yeah, so within the US Senate, the Republican support is still very solid. Starting with leader McConnell and most of the people in his party. There are a few senators who are skeptical, but they're really in a minority. But within the House of Representatives, right, it's the, you know, more extreme wing, I would say. The people who are supporters of former President Trump and who are supporters, you know, the new Speaker of the House, Michael Johnson, comes from that wing. And although he himself has said we have to support Ukraine, people like, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene, we can name a small number of them, but they're adamantly against supporting Ukraine. And they like Putin, and they put out statements saying that, you know, President Zelensky is a drug addict. I mean, all of these things, accusations. So they're a minority, but they're a vocal minority. And among Trump's supporters, the people who are likely to vote for him, those people also, you know, do not support Ukraine. And some of them support Russia. And part of that is because, you know, what Putin has said about Russia being the harbinger and the leader in sort of traditional family values. And he's doubling down on that, Putin. And he did it again in the speech, I think yesterday. And so that appeals to them too. So it's not only don't support Ukraine, but it's we like Putin. And then some of them will argue that, you know, what the US should do is focus on its own southern border and obviously the problem with all of the migrants. So that's where we are at the moment, and a minority of Republican voters now say that we should be, you know, continuing to support Ukraine.
And kind of just looking, is that debate changed in any way by the full extent now of the emergence at this time of Russia's relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and indeed Russia's relationship with Hamas? Does that tilt the debate at all within the GOP in a more Ukraine-friendly direction, or at least an anti-Russian or anti-Putin direction?
Yeah, I haven't seen very much of that. Obviously, some people have spoken about it. I haven't seen any data on that yet, but that hasn't been very prominent in the public debate.
Yeah.
But that could change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just looking on this now, the situation now, in terms of the actual situation on the ground and your assessment as Soviet spokesman used to say of the correlation of forces. What's your assessment of the correlation of forces at this stage as we enter December 2023?
Right. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive didn't accomplish everything that I think many in the West thought it might, or that the Ukrainians hoped that it would. They were able to take some more territory back. They've certainly hit things in Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet is now not being able to operate out of Sevastopol. So there have been some gains on the Ukrainian side, but they weren't able to make the breakthroughs that they want to. And meanwhile, the Russians, used the past year to put all these, to mine much of the country with very sophisticated mines, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to break through. Russia, we know, has also been acquiring more weapons, obviously the artillery from North Korea, drones from Iran, but they've also stepped up their own production. And so there is a concern as we go into winter now that the Russians will use this to do what they did last year, which is to bomb and try and destroy the energy facilities in Ukraine to make it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to heat their homes and have light and things during winter. So you could see a much more aggressive Russian campaign, and we saw a little bit of that even in the last week. Now, the war will continue. There may be another Ukrainian counteroffensive in the spring. The correlation of forces might change, but at the moment it looks like it's a war of attrition. It looks like a sort of dynamic stalemate. And Ukraine obviously continues to need weapons from the West and the support that it's been getting in order to continue fighting this war. And, Putin is playing a long game. And he's waiting, to come back to your first question, for Western resolve to soften, for Western support to evaporate, particularly, again, if we have a president in the United States in 2025 who doesn't want to support Ukraine anymore. So, and the Russians they still have enough young men, or particularly they're taking people from prisons and everything, that they're cannon fodder, and they have the advantage over the Ukrainians. They have 3 times the population.
And just touching on, following on, springboarding off a point that we made last night during Daniel Yogin's presentation, there seemed to be a tilting back in favor of sort of greater durability, perhaps the right word, resilience of the Russian economy, despite sanctions. Just to reflect a little bit on that for the audience here today.
Right, the sanctions haven't had the impact that I think people hoped they would have in the beginning. They did have a financial impact, but Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, she has done very well in the beginning in stabilizing the ruble. The ruble's lost a lot of its value. There are supply chain issues, obviously. The Russians have had to close down certain assembly lines of foreign cars that they were, or with foreign components that they were making. But in general, unemployment is quite low in Russia. So the average Russian, if you live in one of these sort of benighted villages where everyone's poor anyway, they haven't noticed that much difference in their standard of living. And when their sons and brothers and husbands go to fight in the war, they are earning much more money. The soldiers are being paid more than, much more than the average Russian is. And then if they die, their families get a financial premium for that. So that's in the sort of the provincial parts of Russia. And in the major cities, people say you go to Moscow and restaurants are all open. There's shops are filled with goods. They may not be Western goods anymore, but they're substitutes from China and a lot of other countries. So, eventually eventually, I think people believe that the impact of the sanctions will be felt more going forward, but the projections are for the Russian economy to grow by as much as 2%. So I think it doesn't mean that one should stop the sanctions. I think some of them have to be rethought. And then, obviously we already talked last night about the energy sanctions, but Russia is still able to, sell large amounts of hydrocarbons to countries that are still buying them, and despite the oil price cap, it's still making a lot of money from it.
In terms of that definition of resilience, because if one sort of compares an obvious precedent, namely sanctions that many countries had against apartheid era South Africa, what we now know from many of the papers which came out from the Afrikaner government of that era was that technically it was possible to evade a lot of sanctions. In other words, the economic dimension. What really ground down the National Party and other Afrikaner elites in that period were the sporting and other, in other words, respectability and that sense of delegitimation, rather than actually, yes, you could get oil through, prior to 75 through Portuguese, East Africa and so on. And that thing is that how much there is any sense amongst Russian elites being ground down because Russia being beyond the pale because of the conduct of the Putin regime as a moral cause.
But Russia is really only beyond the pale for most of the Western countries.
Yeah.
So yes, and in fact, a lot of the Russian elite resent what they see now as Russian cancel culture, where if an orchestra doesn't want to play, something by Tchaikovsky or something, they resent that, but that doesn't translate into pressure on the government as far as we can see. I mean, the thing that's been remarkable since this war began is that the kind of globalized elites, Russian elites that many of us used to meet at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, at various other international gatherings, and who had their homes and bank accounts in Europe or the United States, and who sent their children, many of them, to school here. All of those people have really buckled down. I mean, Putin said, you don't have a choice. This war it's an existential question. And so whatever they may have thought, they've now accepted the fact that they made a deal with Putin at the beginning when he came in, when he said, you can keep all the wealth you have. I'm talking now about the wealthy oligarchs, but stay out of politics. They didn't quite understand how this deal was going to end. But that's where they are. And they're really only a couple of prominent members of the Russian elite, Anatoly Chubais being probably the best known of them, who've left. And just a couple of weeks ago, Putin publicly excoriated him in an extremely insulting way. So I think that, to go back to your question, this will not translate into them putting pressure on him to end the war. And again, they're not, they can go to China. There are many other countries in the world where these people are still welcome.
And just in terms of obviously the name Putin, I always get it wrong how many times you've actually met him yourself, but just for the public audience.
So I believe it's 16 times, and this is an annual gathering, and I see James Scher there, and he's been at those gatherings too, called the Valdai International Discussion Club, where they brought foreign experts on Russia starting in 2004 to Russia, a very clever public relations move, I would say, and they would take us to see various parts of the Russian Federation, which of course is the largest country in the world. So I saw parts of Siberia that probably would never have seen otherwise. And then we would have either dinner or some other kind of meal with him at the end of these gatherings. And they started off very small, they then got larger, but one could see him evolve over the years.
So be a few others in the room who've had the opportunity, and indeed of our online audience as well, just where you think he is now at this stage in this latest phase of struggle, your assessment?
Well, I think he appears to have persuaded himself that this war with Ukraine is an existential question, and that Russia cannot lose. If you read what he's been writing and you listen to what he's saying, he obviously sees himself as the heir to whether it's Peter the Great, probably Peter the Great, start off with him, gathering in lands that rightfully belonged to Russia and that it lost when the Soviet Union collapsed. He's been quite consistent since the early 90s in really not accepting the collapse of the Soviet Union as an end process itself, and that it can be reversed. Whether he really does believe that the West, particularly the United States, is out to diminish Russia, to chew off a tasty piece of Russia, take some of its territories. I mean, one doesn't know whether he believes that, but he certainly has staked that, this is going to be his legacy for him, is bringing back Ukraine into the fold.
And just sort of going back to your earlier point about not everybody, that sense that yes, there's delegitimation in the West, but not necessarily in the global South. Just a little more on their refusal to take sides in this war in the way that people, perhaps it has resulted perhaps in a measure of tension, for example, between this country and India over how they've had the most obviously prominent. Just reflect on that a little.
So this past year I did a project with a colleague of mine where we had a number of virtual dialogues with experts and former diplomats in a number of global South countries. We had Brazil, India, and South Africa as the three democratic BRICS. We talked to the Mexicans, the Indonesians, and a number of other countries. And for different reasons, they do not see this as their fight. They also say, you expect us to get involved and take sides in what's a European conflict, but you don't really care when there are conflicts in our part of the world, depending on what part of the world it is. I think the Russian narrative has been remarkably successful in persuading particularly the publics in a number of countries in the global South, which I know is a term people don't like very much, but it's a convenient term, that, the Russia was forced to invade Ukraine because it was threatened by NATO enlargement, it was threatened by the West, and they accept some of that. And then there's also, they will refer to what they see as Western hypocrisy. Why should we condemn what Russia is doing in Ukraine? How is that different from what the United States, for instance, did in Vietnam, in Iraq, Afghanistan, choose your conflict. But I think they've also seen this war as a way of asserting more of their own voice in in international affairs, that they see this as a way to say, we're not going to take sides, we're going to remain neutral, but we want you to listen more to what we think. And they also resent the fact that this war has resulted in, the world's attention not on their own issues, for instance, their debt problems, food insecurity, global health problems. They talk about, the hypocrisy also of kind of during the COVID period of the West not being willing to share its vaccines with them. So it's an accumulation, I think, of grievances, and this has been the moment for them to say, we're not going to condemn Russia. Russian propaganda, as I said, has been successful, and the Russians are instrumentalizing the Soviet past with a number of these countries. India, for instance, harking back to the important relationship with the Soviet Union, and the Indians will say, Russia is still the only country that supports us in the UN on the Kashmir issue. But this was particularly true in the South African case, where the African National Congress, of course, many of their leaders were trained in the Soviet Union at the older generation, and they really see Russia as the heir to the Soviet Union that supported them during the anti-apartheid struggle, whereas, for instance, the US government at that time didn't, even though obviously a lot of NGOs did. And some of the South Africans even used the word liberation debt, that they owe something to Russia because of what it did in the past. And the final thing I'll say there, which is sort of amusing, is that when we were talking to the Mexicans, it was also clear that the current Mexican government still, and many of the elite, again, who were around during the Soviet times, still think of Russia somehow as a socialist country. And you have to point out to them that it's not a socialist country anymore. It has a rather unique form of capitalism. So for a number of these reasons, they had these countries, I think, are going to sit this out, and they're not going to support Ukraine.
And just obviously this leads on to Global South, and then looking around the world, China, and perhaps a appropriate question today as we mourn for our good friend Henry Kissinger. And obviously he, and during the mid-60s, and then former Vice President Richard Nixon, when out of office, were amongst the first to spot the possibilities in the Sino-Soviet split of that era, the Ussuri River clashes, and that international communism was not a monolith. And just wondering now, obviously the ambiguities much rather lesser than they were there then, but the ambiguities in the China-Russia relationship now, and what opportunities there might be now, or how different is that hope that some have expressed in the public domain illusory?
Right, so it's interesting, I was reading the New York Times obituary of, it's 5 pages long, so I haven't finished it, of Henry Kissinger today. And one of the things they did quote him on was him being skeptical about the nature of the China-Russia relationship. And in fact, he was quoted as saying, you know, usually when I'm in China, they don't have too many nice things to say about Russia, and when I'm in Russia, they don't have too many nice things to say about China. Although, and I have to say today, by the way, the Russians have been praising Henry Kissinger, and even Dmitry Medvedev, who's now the attack dog, normally during the Ukraine crisis, came out on Twitter with something in English that was very praiseworthy. Now, having said all that, I mean, China has been instrumental in supporting Russia during this war. We don't know what happened when Putin was in Beijing on February the 4th, 2022, and what he may or may not have told President Xi Jinping. But the Chinese will keep saying that, and there's no reason to doubt that necessarily, that they were not informed that this was going to be a full-scale invasion. And yet they have supported Russia certainly in their narrative, backed up the Russian narrative that it had no choice but to invade Ukraine. They have been pretty scrupulous about abiding by Western sanctions because obviously their economic stake is much greater in relations with Europe and the United States than it is with Russia. But you still see when Putin was recently in Beijing, he had sort of pride of place. Xi Jinping gave a speech, then Putin gave the speech, and the way he was treated was certainly very respectable. And as far as one can see, China really doesn't want Russia to lose this war because the two countries are allied in so many ways in terms of their grievances against the West, in terms of wanting a new global order, although I think their respective visions of what that new global order would look like are rather different. But still, this is a very important relationship for the Chinese. And for Russia, you know, Putin has now closed the window on Europe, opened by Peter the Great 300 years ago, and he's really, Russia's lot is now completely thrown in with China, even though Russia is very much the junior partner in that.
Good, and so before going over to the audience for question and answer session there, just one final thing really, if you had a thought on what more or how differently UK policy should be calibrated, looking at it from your vantage point in Washington. Obviously the UK was in a position of leadership, exercising that, was out in front under successive prime ministers here since the war began. I'm just interested what more should be doing, just thoughts from America.
Right. Well, I mean, the UK has been very steadfast in supporting Ukraine through, you know, the different prime ministers, and instrumental really in a way, you know, very importantly. And that support should surely continue to the extent that it can, even though we are all in Western countries ourselves running out of some of the weaponry that we've been supplying to Ukraine. And then I think countering Russian narratives, if we get back to the countries that are on the fence there, doing whatever one can to counter them, even though it's not easy. And particularly, you know, if we're talking about India, reaching out more. I mean, the US has done this certainly now, and the Indians, and when you talk to Indians, by the way, they do say that they realize that Russia cannot give them what they need in terms of the kind of development aid, and only, Western countries, the UK, the US, can.
And do you think that what the UK has achieved in that leadership role, you know about it obviously, is it fully understood in Washington, the degree, and appreciated?
I think it depends on whom you talk to. I mean, again, if we get back to the Trump Republicans, they will say, Europe, and they're talking about everybody, not specifically the UK, isn't doing enough, and we're paying for everything. And of course, if you look at the statistics, that's not true. But I think it's obviously appreciated among the people who are currently in power and know what's going on.
Good. Thank you. So, usual policy exchange house rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. And so, if I just see, gentleman at the back, I see, hand up. Sorry, if you just.
Simon Brocklebank, Fowler, Firehouse. The budget approved by Putin on Tuesday commits Russia to proportionately Cold War I, I should say, levels of expenditure. How sustainable do you think this is? Is it a strategy of Monte Carlo or bust, or perhaps even Götterdämmerung? And how long can they keep it up? And should we lean into that spend as the West, hoping for a similar outcome as we did in the Reagan years? Thank you.
You're talking about the military spending.
Yeah, the military and security expenditures, 40% of GDP, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's jaw-dropping, really, because how much now, they're increasing the spending on defense. I don't know how sustainable it is. I mean, it gets back to, the longer-term impact of some of the sanctions. And then depriving their own population of things that they have expected, they've come to expect in the post-Cold War era. So I think they may run into much more trouble in the coming years.
Good, I see a lot of hands up. Gentleman there in the aisle. Just there. Thank you. Yes, give the microphone. Oh. Name and organisation, please.
I thought you could have done that. Never mind. James Sher, ICDS Estonia and Chatham House London. Thank you, Angela. As you know, I am one of those who believes that the United States has had it within its means who have ensured that Ukraine by now would find itself in a far more advantageous place than it is. I want to raise a question about one side of Republican opinion that does not get heard very often, including the new Speaker of the House, who has said, and he's not the only one who has said, the administration needs to define its strategic objectives. And it hasn't. I mean, as you know, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has said more than once, well, the objective is to put Ukraine in the best possible position to negotiate, without explaining to negotiate about what, and without any evidence that Russia is interested in negotiating about anything. And Biden, in his New York Times article last year, said our objective basically is to ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose. So my question to you is very simple. Does the current administration have a theory of victory, and if so, what is it?
That's the 64,000 ruble question, right? The answer to that is, I really don't know. I mean, it's what the administration says is, as you said, we're going to provide Ukraine with whatever it needs so that it's not defeated by Russia. And as you and I have discussed before, the administration could have provided more weaponry sooner. It could have done more for Ukraine. There is a continuing concern about escalation that has limited, what the U.S. has done. And we can argue whether that's well-founded or not. But they have not communicated what the theory of victory is, what it might look like. what are the territorial aspects of it, and what they would accept as that. So, and I think people are waiting for that, but I don't think that there are articles coming out now suggesting that they're trying to push Ukraine to the negotiating table. As you said, there's no evidence that Russia's interested in it, and I mean, the Ukrainians aren't at the moment. But I don't think they're doing that at the moment. There's a lot of this discussion about it. So I remain also puzzled by what the theory of victory would be, and what what their desired outcome would be.
Gentleman there, yes, on the side. Yes, that's you. Name an organisation, please.
Sure. Michael Fallon, former Defence Secretary. Could you say a little more, thank you for your talk, could you say a little more on that last question about the initial apprehensions in Washington about the use of longer range missiles and attack aircraft? Were those apprehensions misplaced about possible Russian reaction? And are they still valid?
Yeah, I mean, those concerns are still there. I think they probably were misplaced. I think, we were unable to deter Putin from starting this war, but he has succeeded in deterring the West in general, with the threats that one's heard and with the discussions about the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. And so we've been, one could argue that we've been a little excessively deterred by this. Obviously, the Ukrainians have been given the wherewithal to strike in parts of Russia that are sort of near them, but they haven't been given the wherewithal to strike much deeper into Russia, and I don't see that changing with this administration.
Gentleman at the front, please. Just wait till the mic comes. Name an organisation, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul Goodman, editor, Conservative Home. You said earlier that Putin had evolved since you first met him in, I think, 2004.
Right.
Could you say a bit more about how he has evolved and what you think the most important influences are on that evolution, and what the key moments may have been?
So he certainly, the kind of criticism of the West and sort of stressing Russia's exceptionalism, that's something that one can certainly see evolving. I suppose one of the, in 2004, he was, there was, the first meeting they had was literally just after the end of the Beslan hostage crisis, when terrorists in the North Caucasus took a school hostage. And there was a somewhat botched, in the end, resolution of that, where quite a few people died. And at that point, it was a very kind of raw moment because, particularly some Western countries, and I think that, United States and things like that, people weren't using the word terrorists. They were talking, and they had some sympathy for maybe some of the goals of the people in the North Caucasus. So you could already see then an anger about that particular thing. And then I think, as time went on, I would say one moment is clearly the Munich Security Conference, when he stood up and lambasted particularly the United States for what it had done. And so I think, so the accumulated grievances were already there with the first color revolutions, even before we met, and of course the invasion of Iraq. And so 2007 was certainly, I would say, a turning point. And then I would say another one was probably when he stepped back and allowed Medvedev to be president for 4 years, and Libya, what happened with Libya, and the fact that, that Russia abstained on the vote in the UN for the no-fly zone, and then we know what happened to Gaddafi. So that's something that he's come back to time and time again. And then I think, after that, people say that certainly when he came back to power again, having let Medvedev be president for 4 years, it was much more difficult to deal with him. And I think the other side of that was then, beginning the bombing of Syria in 2015, coming back into the Middle East and feeling more confident about what Russia could do as a power, and to regain influence in parts of the world from which it withdrew after the Soviet collapse. And then the anti-Western rhetoric got more and more strident, and then particularly noticeable at these gatherings was then focusing on wokeness in the West. I mean, coming back to this sort of traditional family values part of what he was saying, and putting himself forward as a leader of the of countries who believe in traditional values. So I think there were a number of turning points. I'm not saying that he didn't hold these views before, but I think just given world events and increasing disillusionment with the United States, and I think you come back to really what happened, and this is before we first had these meetings, was after 9/11. You back the United States, and they did share information with the U.S. and other, on the initial phase of the war in Afghanistan, and then feeling that Russia didn't get what it deserved, which was, in return for that, which was a recognition that it did have a right to a sphere of influence in its neighborhood. So what he really wanted was, if you could, like an equal partnership of unequals, and he felt that he didn't get that, and so ever since then, I think it was snowballing.
Thank you. Can I just say how many more people want to ask questions? We've got some online questions as well. Thank you. Just go online. Rupert Gaither, Chairman, Invest UK. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you speak up a little? I think you may be a little faint.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear now. Thank you.
Lovely. Just going on to sort of criminology a bit. Is regime change either by natural causes or enforced really the only way that Ukrainian victory, however you want to define that, comes about?
Well, certainly the only way that the war, in my opinion, is going to stop, at least for the foreseeable future, would be if someone else were in power and decided that it was not in Russia's interest to continue this war, but to focus on its own domestic development. Now, what that would look like in terms of what a future regime would do and where Ukraine would be in terms of at the end of the war, that's harder to speculate. But I think as long as Vladimir Putin or people who share his views are in the Kremlin, it's going to be very difficult to see them changing their policy on this war.
Other questions, please. Lady there in the second row. Name and organization, please.
My name is Celia Massa. I'm the correspondent in London of the Spanish national newspaper La Razón and El Confidencial. I have to tell you that it's a privilege to meet you in person, because as a journalist for foreign affairs, I've been following your job for so many years. So my question is that to what point the current situation with the Middle East could affect the war in Ukraine to increase this Ukraine fatigue, and could
Ukraine
be fatigue.
Yeah.
And could be the case that Ukraine war against Russia could become itself a kind of Middle East situation when we have a war for years. Sometimes the tension escalates, sometimes it's quiet. Thank you.
Yeah. On the first part, I mean, I think for Russia, the current war in the Middle East, has been very welcomed for a number of reasons. One, it's taken attention away from the Russia-Ukraine war. There's much less about it at least in the Western media. So the attention is focused elsewhere. And Russia has been able to, use this quite cleverly to reinforce all the tendencies I was talking about before in terms of relation with the global South. Before the war broke out, Russia had returned to the Middle East and had established relations with most countries in the region. It talked to all sides on all issues and all groups, and including being seen, at least by the Israelis, as an important partner in terms of their ability to defend their own borders in the north, and that relationship had evolved. But of course, now Russia made the choice to solidly support, it didn't condemn what Hamas did. There was a Hamas delegation in Moscow after the massacres. And in general, to very much to support the Palestinian cause in a way that they'd been much quieter about, over the past few years, and that has reinforced their appeal, both to countries in the global south and to groups that share the same views. So far they have, I would say, benefited from it. And on your second question, it's possible that this could be a war that could go on for a long time. With no resolution and maybe with some pauses and ceasefires down the road, but then they would be broken again. Again, depending on the leadership in Russia going forward and who might be there after Putin.
Gentleman there towards the back. Name and organisation, please.
Tobias Selwood, Member of Parliament. It does feel that the West's threshold to deal with challenges and conflicts across the world is being severely tested, particularly with Russia coming under China's orbit. Would you agree that perhaps we've been complacent going back since the fall of the Berlin Wall? We've entered a very difficult era, and there is, on the current trajectory, there's potential for our world to splinter into two spheres of competing influence, with perhaps a number of nations, loosely termed the global south, perhaps taking a seat back, seeing which way things are going to end up.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, I think we were, in the 90s, everyone was hopeful that Russia was going to evolve into something different. However difficult it might have been to deal with Boris Yeltsin. There were, it was a much more pluralistic country then. And then I think even in the beginning, when Putin first came in to power, he gave the impression that he wanted better relations with the West, that he was kind of pragmatic and that he wanted to explore things. And I think it took far too long to understand what direction Russia was going in, and I think there were many illusions about the fact that if you had better economic relations with Russia, then somehow that would have a beneficial effect on political relations. And so, and then I think, and then Putin looked at the reaction when, Russia invaded Georgia, when it annexed Crimea, and it was a fairly mild reaction, really, compared to what it might have been. And so I think you're right. I mean, we now are in a place, obviously, where we have a number of simultaneous crises and wars that are very difficult to deal with. And I think the world will look different when these conflicts are over. And I think you will, in fact, if we come back to the global south, they will probably, some of these countries will be playing a larger role, at least regionally, and it will be more, diffuse. I mean, the Russians always talk about, multipolar world, whatever that means, but it will be more, I think, more diffuse, and there will be, there will still be, hopefully, the collective West, but then, but there will be China and, whatever countries it leads, and then these other countries that don't want to belong to any bloc.
I see online Eric Laurie, Director for Russia at the British Council. Eric, can you hear me? You there? Third time lucky, let's see. Eric, can you hear me? Plenty of questions in the audience. We have a safety valve there. I see. Gentleman there, in the middle aisle. There. Name and organisation, please.
Yes, my name is Bjarne Nørum. I'm the UK correspondent for the Danish daily Kristeligt Dagblad. Bjarne Nørum was my name. Following on from Michael Fallon and the stalemate on the ground, when will we see the impact of the F-16 fighter jets from Denmark, from Holland, etc., coming into action in a very concrete way?
I mean, there are some people. There's some question, right, about how much difference they will make. But I suppose we'll see the impact when everyone is, everyone is sufficiently trained to use them. I don't know if there's anyone else. James, do you have a better sense? You followed the military here better.
I share your skepticism. I think what was needed much earlier, more robust, high quantity deliveries of the essential nuts and bolts stuff. That's what's missing. Not the glamour weapon.
Yeah.
I see a few more hands up still. Yes, gentleman there. Name and organisation, please.
Rupert Dole, Real Clear Foundation. You mentioned Putin's vision of the global order. Can you talk a little bit about his conception of international relations? We know multipolar comes up time and time again, but what kind of multipolarity is that a rules-based order? Is it more Hobbesian? And also where he best sets out this conception.
Right. So I think before this war, what he talked about a lot, and he is, a new Yalta. He praised the Yalta system, how well it operated. We had a stable world, and so in his view, the new world order would be a Yalta where you'd have a Chinese sphere of influence, a Russian, and a U.S., and somehow the world would operate like that. But that would have been an order where there were some rules. Now, if you listen to him, and obviously if you see what Russia is doing, I think his concept is of a disruptive world order, one where there aren't any rules. When he talks about multipolarity he talks about, he's certainly written about and spoken about the democratization of international relations. And by that he means that the US, has much less say in defining the rules or or debating the order there, and that Russia and other countries would have more of a say in setting these rules. But when I look at it now, I don't think he really favors rules. I think it's disruptive, it's Hobbesian, as you said, and you just grab as much as you can, and the use of forces is allowed. And obviously, he's violated Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, all these things that are in the UN Charter. But that's implicit. I haven't, he hasn't, as far as I know, actually said we want a disruptive world order. He's blamed the US and the West for disrupting the world order. But I think his would be a very dark view of world order going forward, whereas I think the Chinese, when they talk about a post-West order, it would be an order with rules. They would have more say in setting these rules, but they would abide by those rules. And I don't think that's Putin's vision anymore.
I know there are many other hands up as well. Who else? Do I see? Or maybe I was imagining. Maybe I was imagining. Anybody else? Lode Williams, you're online. Can you hear me? Or have I again imagined that people disappeared?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay. Aren't we in danger of causing a lot of disillusionment in Ukraine? If the war drags on, they won't be able to join NATO. And the process of joining the EU will be long and difficult. May I point out that there are 3,000 trucks, Ukrainian trucks, stalled, blocked at the Polish border, that the Slovaks might do the same thing, and the Hungarians. Now, what will be the result of this for the Ukrainian polity? Where would it go? Aren't they trapped?
There certainly is the danger of this disillusionment setting in. You're quite right. In terms of EU membership, this is going to take a very long time, and some people obviously believe that there will have to be a reorganization and rethinking of some of the rules when you're thinking about taking in new members with new enlargement before a country like Ukraine will actually be a member. And NATO membership, even though obviously we know that there are some countries that would favor it now or think that at the Washington summit next year, Ukraine should be provided a concrete guarantee that it's going to join a roadmap or something like that. As long as it's at war, that's probably not going to happen. So I think that will, and I think that you can already see within Ukraine, some of the more contentious politics are coming to the surface now. I'm thinking about particularly the interview that Zaluzhny gave to The Economist and what he said about the war, and then Zelensky's response. So some of what would be is normal domestic politics is coming to the fore now, and I think it puts President Zelensky under greater strain. So yes, I think there's certainly a danger of that. You know, after the initial enthusiasm of support for Ukraine, very vocal, and it's also the same with refugees. I mean, a number of countries that took in large numbers of Ukrainian refugees are now less certain, you know, that they want all of them there. I think that is inevitable, and that would be really an argument for, you know, the West to keep up its support for Ukraine and you know, persuade its own publics that they should too.
Brilliant, thank you. Final question. I see online, Rebecca Geach, Policy Officer of the Labour Party and of Spelthorne Constituency Labour Party. Rebecca, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Your question.
Thank you. I just wondered, as the West, if we're being unfair to Ukraine. If we look at our own history, it took us 6 years to win the Second World War. And well, 2 years into that war, we were still in danger of being invaded ourselves. Aren't we expecting a bit much from Ukraine?
I mean, yes, because I think we were all so impressed by the way that the Ukrainians fought back. I mean, at the very beginning of this war, you know, in a number of Western capitals, no one expected Ukraine to last, you know, more than a few weeks in this. So I think we were very impressed by them. And so maybe our expectations were too high. You are right that, you know, if you look back in previous wars, they take time. But I think it's this combination of sort of pressures on the budgets of a number of, you know, of Western countries, and then, you know, the kind of populist mood that is, you know, we see manifest itself in the United States and in other European countries that have, you know, accelerated the timetable by which people have expected the Ukrainians to show gains, and maybe we, you know, our expectations were wrong.
Brilliant. So thank you. Quite apart from the fact it's been a masterclass from you today, Angela, following on from the superb performance of Dan Yogin yesterday, I also just want to praise the audience here today for actually asking questions rather than speeches, and beef to you for answering all the questions so expeditiously. I have to say my heart inwardly sank when I saw the large number of hands up, because I thought we would never get through it, but actually it was done with sort of Stakhanovite rigor, if I may say so, on all sides. That's an unacceptable Sovietological term of art, but really, you know, you're always welcome here. Brilliant performance. As I say, copies of this great work are available at the back for anyone who wants to use it. Not quite like samizdat in these parts, but still one gets a frisson from reading it because the analysis is peerless. Thank you.